History is often remembered as a gallery of great men and their deliberate conquests. We look at the maps of the past and assume that empires rise because a visionary leader willed them into existence, forging destiny through strategy and foresight. But history is rarely so linear. More often, it is a chaotic collision of accidents, unintended consequences, and the butterfly effect of distant catastrophes. Nowhere is this irony more profound or more consequential than in the story of how the most feared military force to ever ride out of the steppes inadvertently acted as the midwife for one of the longest-lasting empires the world has ever known. This is the story of how the Mongol Empire, in their ruthless pursuit of domination and destruction, cleared the board, scattered the pieces, and unintentionally created the perfect vacuum for the rise of the Ottoman Empire. To understand this monumental historical accident, we must first cast our gaze back to the early 13th century, before the name Ottoman meant anything at all, and before the specter of the Mongols had fully darkened the horizon of the Middle East. At this time, the dominant power in Anatolia, the peninsula that constitutes modern-day Turkey, was the Sultanate of Rum. These were the Seljuk Turks. They were a sophisticated Persianized society that had successfully transitioned from nomadic warriors to settled empire builders. They had established a centralized state with a thriving economy, grand architecture, and a powerful military that acted as the gatekeeper between the fading Byzantine Empire in the west and the Islamic world to the east. The Sultanate of Rum was the shield of the region. It was stable, it was wealthy, and under normal historical circumstances, it would have likely continued to dominate the region for centuries, suffocating any smaller tribes that tried to rise within its borders. A small, insignificant clan like the one led by Osman, the father of the Ottomans, would never have found the oxygen to breathe, let alone the space to grow into an empire, under the heavy boot of a strong Seljuk Sultanate. But the wind was changing in the east. Far beyond the mountains of Iran, on the high steppes of Mongolia, a force of nature had been unleashed. Genghis Khan had united the tribes, and his successors were now pushing outward with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The Mongols were not just an army, they were a geopolitical earthquake. As they moved westward, they pushed a tidal wave of humanity ahead of them. This is the first crucial gear in the machine that would build the Ottoman Empire, the refugee crisis. As the Mongol hordes smashed through Asia and into Persia, they destroyed cities that had stood for millennia. They burned libraries, leveled irrigation systems, and slaughtered millions. The terror they inspired was absolute. Consequently, entire populations of Turkic tribes, who had been living in Central Asia and Iran, packed up their tents and fled westward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the Mongol horsemen. These refugees poured into Anatolia. They were not just helpless victims, they were hardened warriors, nomads, and herdsmen looking for new pastures and safety. This mass migration destabilized the demographics of the region. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, already dealing with its own internal politics, was suddenly flooded with unruly, militarized nomadic tribes who did not respect central authority and were looking for land. Among these waves of fleeing humanity were the ancestors of Osman, the Kai tribe, and thousands of others like them. The Mongols, by displacing these people, were unknowingly stocking the pond with the very fish that would eventually eat the entire ecosystem. However, the mere presence of these tribes wasn't enough to create an empire. The existing power structure had to be broken. That breaking point arrived in the year 1243. The Mongol commander Baiju Noyan, representing the expanding Ilkhanate, the southwestern sector of the Mongol Empire, decided it was time to bring Anatolia to heel. The Seljuk Sultan, Khosrow II, was a man of immense confidence, perhaps too much. He assembled a massive army, bolstered by mercenaries and vassals, to meet the Mongol threat. They met at a place called Kosei Dag. It was a mountain pass, a place where the terrain should have favored the defenders. The Seljuks outnumbered the Mongols significantly. In a traditional narrative, the shield of Anatolia would hold, the barbarians would be turned back, and the status quo would be preserved. But the Mongols did not fight traditional battles. They fought with a fluid, terrifying discipline that the heavy cavalry of the Seljuks could not counter. The Battle of Kosei Dag was not a long, drawn-out war. It was a swift, brutal shattering. The Mongols' feigned retreat drew the Seljuk vanguard into a trap and annihilated them with a storm of arrows that blackened the sky. Seeing his elite troops evaporated in minutes, the Sultan panicked. He fled the battlefield before the day was even lost, taking his treasury and his dignity with him. The Seljuk army dissolved. This moment, the disaster at Kosei Dag, is the exact moment the Ottoman Empire became possible. The Mongols did not want to rule Anatolia directly. They had no interest in setting up a bureaucracy in the rugged mountains of Turkey. They preferred the open steppes of Persia. They wanted tribute. They wanted money. So they reduced the Seljuk Sultan to a humiliating puppet. The central authority of the Sultanate of Rum was broken. The shield was smashed. What happens when a centralized empire collapses but the conqueror refuses to occupy the land? Chaos. But it is a specific kind of chaos. It is a power vacuum. The authority of the capital, Konya, evaporated. The outlying provinces, especially those on the western frontier bordering the Byzantine Empire, were suddenly left to their own devices. The Seljuk governors and local tribal leaders realized that the Sultan could no longer protect them, nor could he command them. Anatolia fractured into what historians call the era of the Beyliks. The land shattered into a dozen small independent principalities, each ruled by a bey, or warlord. It was a Game of Thrones scenario on the Anatolian plateau. You had the Karamanids, the Germianids, the Aydinids, and many others. And there, in the northwest corner, the smallest and seemingly least significant of them all, was the Beylik of Osman. Here is where the Mongol influence becomes even more subtle and decisive. If the Mongols had destroyed the Seljuks and left entirely, the larger, more powerful Turkish tribes in central Anatolia, like the Karamanids, would likely have consolidated power and created a new centralized Turkish state similar to the old one. They would have crushed Osman's tiny statelet in its infancy. But the Mongols didn't leave entirely. The Ilkhanate established a heavy-handed hegemony over eastern and central Anatolia. The Mongols kept a boot on the neck of the central Anatolian powers. The Mongol governors and tax collectors were constantly harassing the larger beyliks that were closer to the Mongol center of power in Iran. The Karamanids and Germianids spent decades fighting feudal wars against the Mongol overlords, exhausting their resources and their manpower. They were trapped in the center, pinned down by the Mongol menace. Osman, however, was lucky. His territory was located in Bithynia, in the extreme northwest. He was on the very edge of the map, as far away from the Mongol center of power in Tabriz as one could get while still being in Anatolia. To the Mongol tax collectors, Osman was a nobody. He was a petty chieftain ruling over a few thousand tents on the frontier. He wasn't worth the cost of a military expedition. This geographic isolation, gifted by the Mongol focus on the center and east, allowed the Ottomans to fly under the radar. While his rivals were being bled dry by Mongol tribute and punitive raids, Osman was free to grow, and he had something his rivals did not: a border with the Byzantine Empire. This brings us back to the refugee crisis the Mongols created. Remember those waves of Turkic warriors fleeing the Mongol terror? They kept moving west. They didn't want to stay in central Anatolia where the Mongols were still lurking. They pushed all the way to the frontier, to the land of Osman. These were the Ghazis, holy warriors seeking plunder and glory. Because Osman shared a border with the crumbling Christian empire of Byzantium, he became a magnet for these displaced warriors. If you were a young Turkic fighter who had lost his home to the Mongols, where would you go? You wouldn't go to the Karamanids, who were fighting a losing battle against the Mongol Ilkhanate. You would go to the frontier. You would go to Osman. He offered the opportunity for Gazu, holy war, against the Byzantines. He offered land, loot, and a purpose. The Mongols, by terrorizing the East, acted as a hydraulic press, squeezing the most militant, aggressive, and desperate elements of Turkic society westward, right into Osman's open arms. His small tribe swelled into an army. The intellectual capital fled west as well. It wasn't just soldiers, it was scholars, mystics, administrators, and craftsmen fleeing the burning cities of Central Asia. They brought the Persianized high culture, the administrative know-how, and the Sufi spiritual orders that would form the backbone of the Ottoman state. They all ended up in the safety of the western frontier because the Mongols had made the east uninhabitable. Furthermore, the Mongols inadvertently removed the Ottomans' biggest potential external threat. In the mid-13th century, the Byzantine Empire was already in decline, but it as still a formidable regional player. However, the geopolitical chaos caused by the Mongols disrupted the trade routes and alliances that Byzantium relied on. More importantly, the Mongols had utterly destroyed the balance of power in the Middle East. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, besieged and sacked Baghdad. This event is often cited as the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The Caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate created a crisis of legitimacy in the Islamic world. Who was the leader? Who held the sword of Islam? For a time, it was the Mamluks of Egypt who claimed that mantle by defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut. But in the long run, the fall of Baghdad opened the door for a new claimant to the caliphate. By shattering the old order, the Mongols created a theological and political vacancy that the Ottomans would eventually fill. They didn't just conquer territory, they conquered the idea of universal Islamic sovereignty, which the Ottomans would later adopt to justify their rule over the Arab world. Let us look closer at the mechanics of the Ottoman expansion to see the Mongol fingerprints. As Osman and his son Orhan began to take Byzantine cities, Bursa, Nicaea, Nicomedia, they were building a state that combined the nomadic vitality of the steppes with the settled bureaucracy of the conquered lands. This hybrid vigor was only possible because the Mongols had severed the connection to the traditional Seljuk way of doing things. The Ottomans had to innovate. They had to be pragmatic. If the Seljuk Sultanate had remained intact, the Ottomans would have been nothing more than border guards, a minor vassal state expected to send tribute to Konya. They would have been integrated into a rigid hierarchy, but because the Mongols had smashed that hierarchy, Osman was a sovereign ruler. He minted his own coins. He had his own name add in the Friday prayers. These are the marks of a sultan, not a vassal. The Mongol destruction of Seljuk legitimacy meant that any warlord with enough swords could claim to be the chosen of God. Osman proved to be the most capable of them all. Even the decline of the Mongol Ilkhanate played into Ottoman hands. By the 1330s, the Mongol power in the Middle East was disintegrating into factionalism. As the Mongol grip loosened, the other Anatolian beyliks were left exhausted and impoverished from decades of tribute and warfare. The Ottomans, having been shielded by distance and fueled by Byzantine plunder, were fresh, wealthy, and confident. They turned around and began to swallow their Turkish neighbors one by one. The Karamanids, who had once looked down on the Ottomans as rustic border peasants, found themselves outmatched. The Ottomans had used the time of Mongol dominance to build a war machine that the older, battered beyliks could not withstand. It is also worth noting the economic shift. The Mongol Empire, for all its destruction, eventually created the Pax Mongolica. They stabilized the Silk Road under a single security umbrella, allowing trade to flow from China to the Mediterranean with unprecedented ease. However, because the Mongols had destroyed the northern routes and the central infrastructure of Iran, trade routes shifted. The northern route through the Golden Horde and the southern routes toward the Mediterranean became vital. Anatolia became a bridge. As the Ottomans captured the key ports and cities of western Anatolia, they positioned themselves at the terminus of these revitalized trade networks. They became the gatekeepers of trade between the Mongol East and the European West. The wealth that flowed into the Ottoman state helped fund their expansion into the Balkans. So, the Mongols not only provided the manpower and the political vacuum, but they also inadvertently rewired the global economy in a way that enriched the strategic location the Ottomans happened to occupy. There is a profound irony in the military tactics as well. The early Ottoman army was modeled heavily on the Mongol style of warfare. Fast light cavalry, feigned retreats, and horse archers. The refugees who joined Osman had fought either against or alongside the Mongols. They had learned from the masters of war. The Ottomans adopted the lethal efficiency of the steppe and combined it with the siege engineering needed to take Byzantine cities. In a sense, The Ottoman army was a child of the Mongol military revolution, adapté, for the terrain of the Mediterranean. By the time the Mongol tide truly receded from history, leaving behind a fragmented Persia and a ruined Baghdad, the Ottoman state had set its roots deep into the soil of history. They had crossed the Dardanelles into Europe. They had established a capital. They had created a dynasty. If we remove the Mongols from the equation, the history of the world is unrecognizable. Without the Battle of Kosei Dag, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum likely survives. It acts as a buffer. It suppresses the smaller tribes. The Kai tribe remains a minor footnote, perhaps assimilated into the Seljuk military structure. The Byzantine Empire faces a traditional, predictable enemy in the Seljuks, rather than the fanatical, expansionist fervor of the early Ottomans. The demographics of Anatolia remain more stable. The massive influx of radicalized warriors and scholars does not happen in the same concentrated way. The rise of the Ottomans was not destiny. It was the result of a specific set of catastrophic variables. It required the destruction of the existing order. It required a power vacuum. It required a massive displacement of people. It required the distraction of major powers. The Mongols provided every single one of these prerequisites. Genghis Khan and his grandsons, Hulegu and Batu, saw themselves as the punishers of the world. They believed they were conquering for the eternal blue sky. They had no interest in the small, rugged lands of western Anatolia, nor did they care about a minor chieftain named Osman. Yet, their actions were the catalyst. They broke the jar of the Middle East, and in the cracks, the Ottoman seed took hold. It is a lesson in the complexity of historical cause and effect. The Mongols burned cities to the ground, but the heat of that fire germinated the spores of a new empire. They destroyed the caliphate in Baghdad, only to pave the way for a new caliphate in Istanbul. They crushed the Islamic world's political structure, only to enable the rise of the power that would besiege Vienna and terrify Europe for centuries. So when we look at the majestic mosques of Istanbul, or trace the borders of the empire that once spanned 3 continents, we must acknowledge the silent, ghostly presence of the Mongol horsemen in the background. They were the unwitting architects. They cleared the site, dug the foundation, and provided the raw materials. They did not intend to create the Ottoman Empire. In fact, they would have likely burned it down had they noticed it rising. But history does not care about intentions. The Ottoman Empire, in all its glory and longevity, was the phoenix that rose from the ashes of the Mongol apocalypse. It was the unintended legacy of the steppe, and it serves as a powerful reminder that in history, destruction and creation are often just 2 phases of the same cycle, driven by forces far beyond the control of any single ruler or nation. The Mongols came to destroy the world and, in doing so, they accidentally built a new one.